The teeth marks on the pine bark were human-sized, stripped in vertical lines as if someone had been gnawing the tree itself. Robert Fitzgerald crouched beside the white pine, his knees protesting after 28 years of this work, and ran his fingers along the gouges. The bark came away in brittle fragments, exposing wood underneath that looked almost polished, smooth. Worried by something with enough patience to work at it for hours. He'd seen bear scratches, deer rubs, porcupine damage. This was none of those. The marks were too deliberate, too uniform, and they circled the trunk at exactly 5 feet 7 inches. He'd measured. The height of a standing human. The height, according to the missing person report folded in his jacket pocket, of Emma Sullivan. Isle Royale in October was a study in abandonment. The last ferry had carried away the final tourist 3 weeks ago, leaving the island to the wolves, the moose, and the skeleton crew of rangers who stayed through the off-season. Robert preferred it this way. 46 miles of wilderness stretched between him and any meaningful help, separated from the Michigan mainland by 15 miles of Lake Superior's cold indifference. The park hosted 500,000 acres of silence, broken only by wind through pine and the percussion of his own boots on stone. But something had changed in the last 72 hours. The island felt different, wrong in a way he couldn't articulate to dispatch without sounding like he'd spent too long alone. Emma Sullivan had been reported overdue by her sister on Tuesday morning. 26 years old, experienced backpacker, solo hiking the Greenstone Ridge Trail with a satellite phone and enough supplies for 5 days. Her last check-in had come from Rock Harbor at dawn on Saturday. She should have emerged at Wendigo, the island's western station, by Monday evening. When she didn't, her sister activated the emergency protocols, and Robert drew the short straw for the initial search. He'd found her tent still pitched at 3 Mile Campground, 23 miles into her planned route. The tent was intact, properly staked, the rainfly taut. Inside, her sleeping bag lay spread across the pad, and her pack sat upright in the corner, with all her food still sealed in its bare canister. Her satellite phone was there too, battery at 64%, no calls made or received since Saturday morning. Her boots stood outside the tent, laces tied, as if she'd simply stepped out of them and walked away barefoot into 40-degree weather. The only thing missing was Emma Sullivan herself. That had been yesterday. Robert had documented the scene, radioed the findings to headquarters in Houghton, and begun the systematic grid search protocol he'd executed hundreds of times before. By nightfall, he'd covered a 2-mile radius around the campsite and found nothing. No tracks, no torn clothing, no blood. Just the undisturbed forest and that growing sense of wrongness pressing against his skin like a fever. This morning, he'd discovered the tree. Robert straightened, his spine crackling like kindling. The October sky hung low and gray, promising snow that shouldn't arrive for another 3 weeks. The temperature had dropped 15 degrees overnight, and the wind carried a smell he couldn't place, something organic and spoiled, but also mineral, like stones pulled from deep water. He pulled his Motorola radio from his belt. Unit 7 to base. Static answered for 5 seconds before Sarah Chen's voice cut through. Base. Go ahead, 7. Found something unusual at 3 Mile. Damage to a white pine approximately 30 yards northeast of Sullivan's campsite. Appears to be... He paused, searching for language that wouldn't make him sound unstable. Consistent with human teeth marks. The silence stretched longer this time. Say again, 7. Tree bark has been stripped by what looks like human dental structure. Multiple gouges, systematic pattern. Height consistent with missing subject. Copy that. Sarah's tone had shifted into the careful neutrality she used when documenting statements that would later require explanation. Any other evidence in the immediate area? Robert scanned the understory. Brittle ferns, moss-covered stones, a deadfall maple slowly returning to soil. Nothing moved except the wind. Negative. Continuing search pattern. Additional resources are being mobilized. Mainland SAR team estimates 6 hours to deployment. Weather Service is tracking a system moving in faster than projected. You've got maybe 12 hours before conditions deteriorate. Understood. 7 out. He clipped the radio back and stood motionless, listening. The silence on Isle Royale was never truly silent. There was always wind, always the distant percussion of Lake Superior against stone. But now, standing in the filtered light beneath ancient pines, Robert noticed what was missing. No birds. The hermit thrushes that should be staging their migration south were absent. No squirrels chittering in the canopy. No rustle of voles in the leaf litter. The forest was holding its breath. Robert had spent nearly 3 decades in wilderness areas across the Park Service. He'd pulled bodies from crevasses in the Rockies, tracked lost children through the Smokies, documented bear attacks in Alaska. He'd learned to trust his instincts in the backcountry, and every instinct he possessed was now screaming at him to return to the boat dock, radio for immediate extraction, and let someone else finish this search. Instead, he consulted his GPS, a Garmin E-Trex he'd purchased in 2005, and marked the tree's coordinates. Then he moved northeast, following the theoretical path Emma Sullivan might have taken if she'd left her tent in the middle of the night. The terrain rose gradually toward the Greenstone Ridge, the spine of volcanic rock that ran the length of the island. Spruce and fir gave way to exposed stone and stunted birch. Robert checked his compass every 100 yards, a habit from the days before GPS, and noted each time that the needle wavered before settling. Normal magnetic variation, probably. The Keweenaw Peninsula was rich in iron deposits. Probably. At 14:37 hours, he found the second tree. This one was a paper birch, its white bark peeled away in strips that littered the ground like molted skin. The damage was more extensive here, more frenzied. Some of the gouges had broken through to the cambium layer, and the wood wept clear sap that looked too much like saliva. Robert's hands were shaking as he photographed the scene. The tremor wasn't from cold, though the temperature continued to drop. He'd seen people do strange things under stress. Hypothermia made victims strip off their clothes. Hypoxia caused climbers to have conversations with people who weren't there. But the methodical nature of this damage suggested intent, purpose, something that couldn't be explained by medical emergency or environmental exposure. He was beginning to formulate theories he didn't want to consider. The radio crackled. Base to 7. Go ahead. Update on weather system. Front is accelerating. You've now got an estimated 8 hours before the first snow. Mainland SAR is requesting you consider extraction and resumption of search with full team tomorrow. Robert looked at the ravaged birch tree, then at the forest stretching northeast toward the ridge. Somewhere out there, Emma Sullivan was either alive and in desperate need of help, or dead in a way that would require explanation. Either way, 8 hours wouldn't be enough time to find her if he had to hike back to Rock Harbor for extraction. Negative on extraction, he said. I'll establish camp at Lane Cove and continue until dark. Resume at first light if necessary. Another pause. Copy that, 7. Be advised, you're pushing protocol limits. Understood, 7 out. He knew Sarah was right. Protocol dictated a 2-person minimum for extended searches in remote areas. Protocol demanded he wait for the SAR team, let them bring their infrared, their dogs, their additional manpower. Protocol was designed to prevent single rangers from becoming additional casualties. But Protocol hadn't seen these trees. Robert moved faster now, covering ground with the ground-eating stride he'd developed over decades of backcountry patrol. The forest remained silent, absent of the life that should fill it. Once, he spotted movement in his peripheral vision and spun to find nothing but trembling aspen leaves, though the wind had momentarily died. By 16:30 hours, he'd gained the lower slopes of the Greenstone Ridge. The trail here was clear, well-maintained, marked with cairns every 100 feet. Emma Sullivan would have followed this path, enjoying the views across endless forest to where Lake Superior's gray water met gray sky. That's when he found the blood. Not much. Just a smear on a trailside stone, rust brown and mostly dried. Robert swabbed it with an evidence kit from his pack, sealed the sample, and marked the location. The blood trail led off trail, northeast again, into a section of forest too dense for casual hiking. He followed it. The trees pressed closer here, black spruce and balsam fir grown so tight that the understory disappeared into shadow, even in mid-afternoon. The blood appeared in irregular intervals. A drop on moss, a smear on stone, a palm print on birch bark that made Robert's stomach clench with its desperation. The hand had been reaching upward, fingers spread, as if trying to climb the tree. At 17:15 hours, with maybe 2 hours of usable daylight remaining, Robert emerged into a small clearing, a natural amphitheater of stone surrounded by ancient cedars, their roots gripping exposed bedrock like arthritic fingers. The clearing was perhaps 30 feet across, and in its center stood a cairn, but not a trail marker. This cairn was substantial, man-height, constructed from hundreds of carefully balanced stones. And it was old. The rocks had weathered, grown lichen, settled into positions that spoke of years, maybe decades of undisturbed existence. Robert approached slowly. The stones showed no obvious pattern, no deliberate arrangement. Just a pile of rocks, the kind of thing humans had been building since the Stone Age for reasons anthropologists still debated. Burial marker, territorial claim, spiritual significance, warning. Something lay at the cairn's base. Robert's hand moved to his bear spray before his conscious mind registered the shape. Not a bear, not Emma Sullivan. Bones, not human. He could tell that much from the size and structure. Deer, probably. Or maybe a wolf. The skeleton was incomplete, scattered around the cairn's base like offerings. Most of the bones showed signs of gnawing, but the tooth marks were wrong again. Too straight, too purposeful. Several of the larger bones had been cracked open, the marrow extracted. Robert's radio crackled with static, then went silent. He tried to call base and got nothing but white noise that sounded almost like whispering. He checked the battery, full, and the frequency, correct. The radio simply wasn't working. The temperature had dropped another 5 degrees in the last 15 minutes. His breath came out in visible clouds now, and the light filtering through the canopy had taken on the flat, gray quality that preceded snow. Robert consulted his GPS and found the screen flickering, coordinates jumping randomly before stabilizing. According to the device, he was simultaneously at his marked position and somehow 147 miles northeast, in the middle of Lake Superior. That's when he heard the sound. It came from everywhere and nowhere, a vocalization that his mind struggled to categorize. Not animal, not exactly human. A cry that rose and fell in cadence with the wind, forming almost words in a language he didn't recognize. The sound carried pain, desperation, hunger, an endless aching hunger that resonated in his own stomach until he realized he hadn't eaten since dawn and was suddenly, inexplicably ravenous. Robert backed away from the cairn, his hand still on the bear spray, though some part of him understood it would be useless. The cry came again, closer now, and with it came the smell. That same mineral and rot stench he'd noticed that morning, but stronger, concentrated, overwhelming enough to make him gag. Something moved in the trees. He caught only an impression, too tall, too thin, moving with a jerking gait that suggested broken joints or limbs bent in directions biology didn't allow. It stayed just beyond the edge of clear vision, a shape darker than the shadows, circling the clearing with the patience of something that had waited a long time and could wait longer still. Robert ran. Training and protocol evaporated in the face of primal fear. He crashed through underbrush, branches lashing his face, his pack snagging on low-hanging boughs. Behind him the cry rose again, and now he could hear the crash of pursuit, something large forcing its way through the forest with no concern for noise or concealment. He ran for 10 minutes, maybe 15, his 56-year-old cardiovascular system screaming protest. His lungs burned, his legs trembled, and still he ran, because stopping meant confronting whatever was behind him, and his hindbrain had made calculations his conscious mind refused to examine. When he finally stumbled to a halt, gasping, hands on knees, he had no idea where he was. The GPS was still malfunctioning, the radio still dead, and the forest around him had grown so dark it might as well have been midnight. Snow had begun to fall, fat flakes that accumulated on his shoulders and turned his breath to ice. The sound of pursuit had stopped. Robert forced his breathing to slow, forced his mind to re-engage. He was lost, off-trail in deteriorating conditions with failing equipment and something in the forest that had made a 28-year veteran forget every lesson he'd ever learned and run like a panicked animal. He needed shelter. He needed fire. He needed to survive until dawn. A dense stand of spruce offered the best option. Overhead cover, relatively dry ground, and good visibility in all directions. Robert forced his shaking hands to function, clearing a space, gathering deadfall, arranging his emergency bivvy. The lighter clicked 3 times before catching, and the sight of flame made something unknot in his chest. He'd camped alone in wilderness areas hundreds of times. This was just another night, just another search operation, just another. The cry split the night, close enough that he could hear the wetness in it, the ragged breathing between syllables. Robert fed more wood to the fire, knowing the light would mark his position, knowing it didn't matter because whatever was out there already knew exactly where he was. His Motorola radio suddenly crackled to life. "Ven, do you copy? 7, this is base. Do you copy?" Robert grabbed the radio with shaking hands. "Base, this is 7. Copy." "Jesus, Robert, where have you been? We've been trying to reach you for 2 hours. Weather's moving in hard. We need you to abort and return to Rock Harbor for extraction first thing tomorrow." "Negative," he said, staring into the darkness beyond his fire's reach. "I found something. Evidence of Sullivan's presence. Possible trauma. I need to continue the search." "Robert, listen to me." Sarah's voice carried an edge he'd never heard before. "I pulled the file on Sullivan's sister, the one who reported her missing. I called to verify some details. There is no Emma Sullivan registered for backcountry permits this season. That campsite you found, it's been empty since August. I checked the logs." The radio felt suddenly heavy in his hand. "That's impossible. I saw her gear, her satellite phone. I'm sending you the permit database now. There's no record of an Emma Sullivan anywhere in our system. Robert, I think someone is playing a very elaborate joke, or..." She paused. "We need you to come back. Now. Stand by," Robert said, and set the radio down. His pack sat against a tree, and he pulled it open with numb fingers. The evidence bags he'd collected throughout the day were there. The bark samples, the blood swab, the photographs on his camera. He pulled out the folded missing person report he'd been carrying since yesterday. The paper was blank. Not empty. Blank. The text he'd read a dozen times, Emma Sullivan's description and last known location, had vanished as if it had never existed. The paper itself looked old, yellowed, the creases deep as if it had been folded and unfolded for years. Robert's breath came faster. He pulled out his notebook, flipped to the pages where he'd documented the search. His own handwriting stared back at him, but the words were wrong, degraded, some of them in a language he didn't recognize. The dates were wrong, too. According to his notes, he'd been on the island for 6 weeks, not 2 days. The cry came again, and this time he heard the words in it. Old words, borrowed from a language that predated English on this continent by millennia. Words his grandfather had taught him during summers in Upper Michigan, back when the old man was still alive and still remembered the stories. Witiko, hunger spirit, the thing that transformed men into monsters when they crossed the final taboo and consumed human flesh. The thing that haunted isolated places and drove people to madness and worse. His grandfather had called them fairy tales, cautionary stories told to keep children from wandering too far into the forest. But his grandfather had also refused to hunt alone, had insisted on carrying tobacco to leave as offerings, had taught Robert the proper words to speak when entering old-growth woods. Words Robert hadn't thought about in 40 years. Words that suddenly seemed very important. The shape emerged from the darkness between the trees, and Robert's fire seemed to dim in response. It was human-shaped, the way a skeleton was human-shaped. The right number of limbs, the right basic structure, but stretched and wrong. The skin was gray-white, pulled taut over bones that jutted at sharp angles. The hands ended in fingers too long, the nails black and cracked. The face was the worst part. Human enough to recognize, inhuman enough to trigger every evolutionary alarm Robert possessed. Its eyes were the color of old ice, and they fixed on him with an intelligence that made him understand he wasn't being hunted by an animal. He was being tested by something that had once been human and remembered it. The thing that had been Emma Sullivan smiled, and its teeth were stained with bark and blood. Robert's hand closed around the tobacco pouch his grandfather had given him, the one he'd carried for 40 years as a good luck charm without really believing in it. His grandfather's voice echoed in memory, teaching him the proper words, the proper respect, the proper way to address the spirits that older peoples had known to fear. He spoke the words in Ojibwe, the language his grandfather had spoken, the language this land remembered. An apology, an offering, a request for passage. The Wetiko tilted its head, considering. Then it opened its mouth and spoke in Emma Sullivan's voice, perfect and clear and completely wrong coming from that throat. "I was so hungry," it said. "The forest has been hungry for so long." Robert threw the tobacco into the fire. The flames flared green, then white, and the smell of burning sage filled the clearing. The Wetiko shrieked, the same cry he'd been hearing all day, and stumbled backward. It was enough. Robert grabbed his pack and ran again, this time with purpose, using the memory of terrain from 28 years of experience. The Greenstone Ridge Trail was northeast. Rock Harbor was beyond that. The island's emergency shelter at Lane Cove was closer, maybe 2 miles if he could maintain his bearing. Behind him, the Wetiko's cries multiplied. Not one voice now, but many. All the people who'd come to Isle Royale over the decades and never left. All the hunger and desperation that had soaked into this land since the first humans crossed the ice bridge millennia ago. Robert ran through the night, through the snow that fell heavier now, accumulating on the ground and making every step treacherous. His lungs burned, his legs threatened to collapse, and still he ran because the alternative was joining the chorus behind him. He burst from the forest onto the trail at Oro 347 hours. His watch still functioned, at least, and saw the shelter's outline against the pre-dawn sky. The small cabin was locked, but Robert had a master key, and his hands somehow managed to fit it into the lock and turn. He fell inside, slammed the door through the bolt. The cabin was basic: 4 walls, a wood stove, emergency supplies, a radio transmitter. Robert's fingers shook as he powered up the radio, spinning through frequencies until he found the emergency channel. "Mayday, Mayday, this is Ranger Robert Fitzgerald on Isle Royale." "Mayday." Static answered, then, "Robert, this is Sarah. Where the hell are you?" "Lane Cove Shelter. I need immediate extraction. I need..." What did he need? What could he say that would make sense? "There's something wrong with this island. We have a chopper standing by for first light. Weather's breaking. We can be there in 90 minutes. Can you hold position?" Robert looked at the cabin's single window. Gray dawn was bleeding across the sky, and in its light he could see shapes moving at the forest's edge. 7 of them. No, 9. More emerging as the darkness retreated, all with that same too tall, too thin silhouette. "Affirmative," he said. "I can hold." He spent the next hour feeding the wood stove, piling furniture against the door, and trying not to look at the window. The Wetikos circled the cabin, always just visible in peripheral vision, never quite in direct line of sight. They didn't try to break in. They just waited with the patience of things that had waited decades and would wait decades more if necessary. When the helicopter's rotors finally cut the dawn silence, Robert felt something release in his chest. He watched the shapes melt back into the forest, one by one, until only the trees remained. The extraction took 20 minutes. The pilot, a grizzled Vietnam vet named Morrison, took one look at Robert's face and asked no questions. They were airborne and heading toward Houghton before Robert realized he was still clutching his grandfather's tobacco pouch. Sarah met him at the mainland dock with hot coffee and a dozen questions. Robert answered them mechanically, giving her the official version: equipment malfunction, possible hypothermia, no sign of the missing hiker. The version that would go in reports and make sense to people who'd never seen what he'd seen. "There was no Emma Sullivan," Sarah said gently. "We verified it. No one by that name has been on the island this season." "I know," Robert said, and meant it. Whatever he'd been chasing through the forest hadn't been a real person. It had been bait. The island's way of luring him deeper, of testing him, of seeing if he'd cross the lines his grandfather had taught him never to cross. "You're taking leave," Sarah said. It wasn't a question. "Medical evaluation, minimum 2 weeks, and then we'll reassess." Robert nodded. He was already planning his retirement paperwork. 28 years was enough. More than enough. That night in a hotel room in Houghton, he dreamed of forests and hunger. In the dream, he stood at the shore of Lake Superior and watched Isle Royale on the horizon. The island was dark except for a single point of light that moved through the trees, searching. Always searching. He woke before dawn and found himself in the kitchen, staring into the refrigerator with a hunger that made his stomach clench. The hunger passed after a moment, but it left behind an awareness he couldn't shake. The island had marked him. He'd passed its test, had spoken the right words and made the right offerings, had survived when it would have been so easy to give in to desperation and cross the final taboo. But passing the test didn't mean escaping unscathed. For the rest of his life, Robert Fitzgerald would feel the island's pull. On certain nights when the wind came from the north and carried the smell of pine and deep water, he would taste hunger that had nothing to do with food. He would remember the Whiticos circling in the darkness, remember their patience, remember that they were still there, still waiting. And sometimes when he closed his eyes, he could still hear Emma Sullivan's voice asking why the forest had been hungry for so long. The answer was simple and terrible, because there were always people willing to feed it. Robert filed his retirement paperwork on a Tuesday morning in November. The official story was that he'd developed a heart condition requiring immediate medical attention. The unofficial story, whispered among the rangers who'd worked Isle Royale, was simpler. He'd seen something in the forest that 28 years of experience couldn't explain. On his last day, Robert returned to the office early before anyone else arrived. He pulled the files on Isle Royale missing persons dating back to 1940, when the island became a national park. 43 people had vanished over 8 decades. Some bodies had been recovered. Most hadn't. What caught his attention was the pattern. Every missing person had been alone. Every disappearance had occurred in October or November. And in the weeks following each vanishing, rangers had reported equipment malfunctions, unusual animal behavior, and that same smell, mineral and rot, like stones from deep water. Robert added his own report to the file, the real one he'd never submitted officially. He described the cairn, the Whiticos, the voices and languages the land remembered even if its people had forgotten. He described his grandfather's teachings, the tobacco offering, the words that had bought his survival. Then he sealed the file and marked it for restricted access. Future rangers would need to know. Not all of them, just the ones who spent enough time alone in the wilderness to understand that some hungers couldn't be satisfied, only respected. He left his grandfather's tobacco pouch on Sarah Chen's desk with a note, "For emergencies only. You'll know when you need it." 3 months later, Robert received a letter forwarded from the Park Service. No return address, postmarked from Houghton. Inside was a single photograph taken by a trail camera on Isle Royale. The image showed the Greenstone Ridge Trail at dawn. In the foreground, frost covered the rocks. In the background, partially obscured by morning mist, stood a figure. Too tall, too thin, watching the camera with eyes the color of old ice. Robert burned the photograph and tried not to think about how the figure looked familiar. Tried not to calculate the angles and realized the trail camera should have been triggered by the figure's approach but showed only the single frame, as if the thing had simply appeared. Tried not to remember that 3 months ago, in his panic and terror, he'd dropped his Park Service ID somewhere in the forest. His phone rang at 2:37 a.m. on a Tuesday in February. Robert answered without checking the number, knowing somehow what he would hear. Static, wind through pines, and beneath it, that cry, rising and falling, forming almost words in a language the land remembered. The call lasted 7 seconds before disconnecting. Robert lay awake until dawn, feeling the hunger stir in his gut. The island hadn't forgotten him. Perhaps it never would. He'd passed the test, but the test never truly ended. That was the thing about ancient places and ancient hungers. They operated on timescales that made human lives seem brief as mayfly dances. He made coffee as the sun rose and stood at his kitchen window, watching the wind move through the bare trees of his suburban backyard. For just a moment in the space between one heartbeat and the next, the trees looked different. Older, darker, filled with shapes that might have been shadows or might have been something else entirely. Robert blinked and the moment passed. But the hunger remained patient and persistent, reminding him that some forests don't need you to be physically present to maintain their claim. The island was waiting. It would always be waiting. And somewhere in the darkness between the pines, something that had once been human, or perhaps had never been human at all, continued its eternal search for sustenance that could never satisfy. Robert Fitzgerald understood now what his grandfather had tried to teach him all those years ago. Respect the old places, honor the old spirits, and never ever let yourself get hungry enough to forget the difference between survival and surrender. Because the Witiko doesn't just take your body, it takes the part of you that knows when to stop consuming, when to give back, when to recognize that some hunger should never be fed. And once you understand that hunger, once you've felt it moving in your chest and tasted it in your throat, you carry it forever. A reminder that the wilderness isn't just a place you visit, but a force that visits you, that tests you, that remembers you long after you think you've forgotten it. The island remembered Robert Fitzgerald. And in the quiet moments between sleep and waking, in the spaces where hunger and sanity blurred together, Robert remembered the island. Both of them waiting, both of them patient, both of them knowing that eventually, in ways neither could predict, their paths would cross again. Hope you felt genuine terror. If you appreciate authentic horror rooted in real folklore, consider following for more stories. Which moment scared you most? Share your theory about what happened. The elk carcass had been opened wrong. Sarah Brennan had gutted hundreds of winter kills in her 8 years with the Park Service, but none of them had been filleted with this kind of precision. Sternum split vertically, organs removed and arranged in a spiral pattern 30 feet from the body, not a drop of blood anywhere in the snow. She crouched beside the arrangement, her breath forming clouds in the February air. The organs were frozen solid, positioned with deliberate care. Heart at the center, liver and kidneys forming the next ring, intestines coiled in the outer spiral. Someone had taken their time. The snow around the pattern was undisturbed except for a single set of tracks leading away into the old growth. Barefoot impressions, each one sinking deep despite the frozen crust that currently supported Sarah's 140 pounds plus gear. The wrongness of it settled into her bones the way it always did. That peculiar hollow sensation behind her sternum that her ex-husband had called her witch feeling before he'd left. Sarah had learned to trust it during her first year at Olympic National Park, when that sensation had made her check on a solo hiker who'd signed out for an afternoon walk. She'd found him hypothermic and disoriented, 20 yards from a cliff edge, convinced the fog was showing him the trail. The feeling had saved his life. It had also cost her a marriage when she couldn't explain why she'd known to look. Now it was screaming at her. Austin Fletcher had been missing for 36 hours. 23 years old, seasonal trail maintenance, last seen Tuesday afternoon near the Hoh River Trail maintenance shed. His supervisor had called it in Wednesday morning when Austin failed to show for his shift. Standard protocol. Sarah had organized a grid search, called in volunteers from the Fork station, checked the likely areas first. They'd found his truck at the South Fork trailhead, keys still in the ignition, driver's door ajar. His coat was inside, in February, in weather that hadn't broken 40 degrees all week. The barefoot tracks from the elk carcass were the same size as Austin's boots, which they'd found neatly placed beside his truck. Size 11, Red Wing work boots, laces still tied. Sarah stood, her knees protesting the cold. She was 35 but felt older out here, especially in winter. The Hoh rainforest sector was 12 miles of temperate rainforest, Sitka spruce and western hemlock growing so thick the canopy blocked most daylight even at noon. The moss grew a foot thick on every surface. Rain fell 300 days a year. In summer, It was ethereal, cathedral-like. In winter, it was a throat closing around you. She keyed her radio. Brennan to base, found something at coordinates 47.8156, 123.9308. Need Kowalski out here with the camera kit. Static then. Copy that, Sarah. Dave's en route. ETA 20 minutes. Anything we should know? Sarah looked at the spiral of frozen organs, at the tracks leading deeper into the forest where the old growth hadn't been logged in 500 years. Yeah, she said. Bring the file on the Peterson disappearance, and Chen, and Morrison. The static stretched longer this time. You thinking what I'm thinking? I'm trying not to think anything yet. But she was lying, and both of them knew it. Lisa Peterson had vanished 3 years ago, almost to the day. February 2006. Experienced hiker, found her tent set up properly, sleeping bag laid out, boots placed outside the tent flap. No sign of her. Dogs had tracked her scent to the river and lost it. The search had gone on for 2 weeks before the winter storms made it too dangerous. They'd never found a body. David Chen, winter before that, February 2005, cross-country skier, disappeared during a solo expedition. They'd found his skis stabbed into the snow like grave markers, his poles arranged in an X between them. His tracks had led to a frozen stream and stopped, as if he'd simply stepped onto the ice and ceased to exist. Kayla Morrison, February 2004, park volunteer gone during a solo bird survey. They'd found her equipment bag torn open, binoculars shattered, field journal pages scattered across a quarter-mile of forest floor. The pages that were still legible contained increasingly erratic observations. Wrong birds, wrong songs. Nothing migrates here, they're watching, they're so hungry. 4 disappearances in 5 years, all in February, all in the Ho sector, all within a 3-mile radius of where Sarah currently stood. She'd been the lead ranger on 2 of them. The hollow feeling behind her sternum had been present at every scene, but she'd never told anyone. How do you put that in a report? The trees around her creaked in the windless air. That was wrong too. Old growth didn't creak without wind. The moss absorbed everything, sound and motion both. The forest should have been silent except for her breathing. Instead, she could hear something else. A rhythmic sound, distant, like someone chopping wood. But it was the wrong rhythm. Too fast, too regular. More like frantic digging than cutting. And it was coming from the direction of the barefoot tracks. Sarah pulled out her Garmin GPS, marked the coordinates of the elk carcass, and started following the tracks. Protocol said wait for backup. The hollow feeling said move now. The tracks led deeper into the old growth, following no trail that Sarah recognized. This was the original forest, the trees that had been here when the first European explorers had arrived, probably before that. Some of these Sitka spruce were 30 feet around at the base, their canopies invisible somewhere in the gloom above. The moss hung from branches and curtains thick enough to hide behind. In summer, the filtered light made it magical. In February, it made it a labyrinth of shadows and gray-green darkness. The barefoot impressions continued, each one sinking deep into the snow and frozen moss. Sarah bent to examine one and felt her stomach twist. The impression was human-shaped, but the toes were splayed wrong, stretched too wide, and there were what looked like claw marks at the tips. She took out her phone, knowing there would be no signal this deep, but needing the camera. The photo showed what her eyes were seeing, but somehow looked worse on the small screen. Less like a distorted footprint and more like something was wearing a human foot badly, the way a child wears their parents' shoes. The chopping sound had stopped. Sarah straightened slowly, her hand moving to the can of bear spray on her belt. The forest was absolutely silent now. No birds, no wind. Not even the distant sound of the Ho River, which should have been audible from here, just her breathing and the blood pounding in her ears. Then she heard the voice. Sarah. Quiet, from somewhere ahead. Sarah, I'm so cold. Austin's voice. She'd heard it dozens of times. At the seasonal orientation meetings, calling questions across the maintenance shed. That one time he'd helped her free an injured fawn from a fence, his voice gentle and patient with the terrified animal. This was Austin's voice, but there was something underneath it, something that made her bones ache. "Austin?" She kept her hand on the bear spray. "Where are you?" "So cold, Sarah, so hungry. Please help me. I can't remember when I last ate." The voice was coming from ahead, maybe 50 yards, but the trees made it impossible to judge distance. Sarah moved forward carefully, following the tracks. They led to a small clearing where the canopy opened slightly, letting in weak gray light. In the center of the clearing stood a shape. It was Austin, and it wasn't. He was naked, his skin the color of old ice, stretched tight over bones that seemed too long, too angular. His feet were bare and bloody, toes splayed and tipped with what looked like torn nails or broken claws. His fingers were the same, elongated and wrong. But his face was the worst, still recognizably Austin's features but hollow, the cheeks sunken so deep his teeth were visible through the skin, his eyes filmed over with white like a dead fish. He smiled at her, and his teeth had doubled in number, a shark's rouse filling his mouth. "Sarah." The voice came from his mouth, but his lips didn't quite match the words. "I'm so hungry, it never stops. I ate everything, but I'm still so hungry." Sarah's hand tightened on the bear spray, but she didn't draw it. Something in her gut told her it wouldn't help, that whatever was wrong with Austin was beyond pepper spray, beyond anything in her training manual. The hollow feeling in her chest had become a cavern. "Austin, what happened to you?" Her voice came out steady, which surprised her. "I found something." His head tilted at an angle that would have broken a normal neck. "In the old maintenance shed, behind the wall, drawings, words in a language I couldn't read. I tried to photograph them, but my camera wouldn't work. The batteries died. All of them. Even the fresh ones." Sarah's mind raced. The old maintenance shed had been built in the 1960s, abandoned in the 80s when they'd built the new facility. It was still standing but scheduled for demolition. Austin had been working alone there Tuesday, clearing equipment before the teardown. "What kind of drawings?" She was stalling, trying to think. Her radio wouldn't work out here. Too much interference from the old growth. Her GPS would still track, but the nearest backup was Dave Kowalski, still 15 minutes away at the elk carcass site. Spirals. Austin's wrong smile widened. Spirals made of animals. Spirals made of people. And a figure, tall and thin, with antlers and too many teeth. There were words beneath it. Wedico. Wendigo. Wendigo. Different spellings, but the same thing, Sarah. The same thing that's been here longer than the trees. The word hit her like a physical blow. Wendigo. She'd heard it before, years ago, during a cultural sensitivity training. The ranger from the Kino Nation had talked about the traditional stories, the beings that haunted the deep forest, the spirits born from cannibalism and greed. Creatures of eternal hunger that could never be satisfied, that transformed humans into monsters. The ranger had been careful to present it as folklore, but Sarah remembered the look in his eyes when a seasonal worker had laughed. That look had said, "You laugh because you don't know. You laugh because you've never been in the deep woods in winter." "That's just a story," Sarah said, but the words felt hollow even as she spoke them. "I thought so too." Austin took a step toward her, and Sarah heard his feet crack on the frozen ground, literally crack, like ice breaking. "But then I got so hungry, Sarah. I'd eaten lunch, 2 sandwiches, an apple, trail mix. But after I read those words, I got so hungry. I went outside to my truck, ate everything in my cooler, drove to Forks, bought everything at the gas station, ate it all, still hungry. The hunger was in my bones, Sarah, in my teeth, in my head." He took another step. His movements were wrong, jerky, like his joints were bending in directions they shouldn't. "I drove back here, couldn't go home. The hunger wouldn't let me near people. It wanted me here, in the deep woods. I walked into the forest, found an elk. It was already dead, frozen in the snow. I ate it, Sarah. Raw, frozen, ate everything. Organs first, they were softest, but I was still so hungry." Sarah's mind was putting pieces together she didn't want to assemble. The elk carcass she'd found hadn't been dead. It had been killed, butchered with precision, organs removed and arranged in a spiral, like the drawings Austin had described. The others, she whispered. Peterson, Chen, Morrison. Did they find the drawings too? Austin's filmed-over eyes seemed to focus on her, though she wasn't sure he could really see her. I met them. In the forest. They're here, Sarah. All of them. They're so hungry. We're all so hungry. The Wendigo doesn't kill you. It makes you into itself. It spreads like a disease, like hunger that never ends. We were food for it, and now we're hungry like it. Forever hungry. He lunged. Sarah sprayed him point blank with the bear spray. It should have dropped him instantly. Police-grade capsaicin, enough to stop a grizzly. Instead, Austin jerked back, his ruined face showing no pain, only confusion. The spray hung in the air between them like mist. That won't work, he said quietly. Nothing stops the hunger. I tried, Sarah, I tried to fight it, but it's so strong. And now others are coming. Can you hear them? Sarah listened. In the distance, from 3 different directions, she heard footsteps. Multiple sets, moving through the forest with the same wrong rhythm she'd heard earlier. That too fast, too regular pace. She ran. Behind her, Austin called out, "Don't run, Sarah. It only makes the hunger stronger." That's what the drawing said. The Wendigo hunts. That's what it is. Eternal winter, eternal hunger, eternal hunting. And now it knows you're here. Sarah crashed through the forest, her training forgotten. Raw panic taking over. The GPS on her belt bounced against her hip. She was moving roughly northwest toward where she'd left Dave at the elk carcass. She had to warn him. Had to get out of this sector. Had to... A shape moved in her peripheral vision. She turned, slipped on the moss-covered ice, went down hard. Her radio skittered across the frozen ground and disappeared into a snowbank. The shape resolved into a woman, Lisa Peterson, or what had been Lisa Peterson 3 years ago. Same elongated limbs, same ice-white skin, same dead eyes and too many teeth. She was wearing the remains of hiking clothes, frozen and torn, hanging from her frame like burial shrouds. "The hunger is beautiful," Lisa said in a voice like wind through dead trees. "Once you stop fighting it, once you accept that you'll never be full. The relief, Sarah. The relief of giving up." Sarah scrambled backward, found her footing, ran in a different direction. Her lungs burned. The hollow feeling in her chest had become a scream. 2 more shapes emerged from the trees. David Chen and Kayla Morrison, or what they'd become. Chen's cross-country skiing gear was still partially visible, frozen to his transformed body. Morrison's neck was bent at an impossible angle, but she moved fluidly, her filmed eyes tracking Sarah's movement. "We've been waiting," Morrison said. "The drawing said it needs 4. 4 to make a circle, 4 to open the way, 4 to make the forest sacred to it again." Sarah's mind, even in panic, caught the implication. 4. Austin made 3. If they got her, that made 4. 4 disappearances in the Ho sector, all in February. Not random, planned. The Wendigo, or whatever was using that name, was collecting them, transforming them, creating its own hunting pack. She broke through a line of spruce and found herself at the Ho River. The water was running low, winter slow, dark as coffee. Ice clung to the banks. This was where David Chen's trail had ended 5 years ago, where the dogs had lost Lisa Peterson's scent, the boundary. Behind her, the footsteps multiplied. Not just 3 anymore. More. How many had disappeared over the years that hadn't been reported? How many seasonal workers, how many hikers, how many people who'd been written off as lost to the wilderness instead of transformed by it? Sarah splashed into the river. The cold hit her like electricity, water instantly filling her boots, soaking her pants. The current was stronger than it looked, pulling at her legs. She pushed forward, fighting for the opposite bank. Behind her, the footsteps stopped at the water's edge. "It won't cross," Austin's voice called. The river, moving water. The old protections still hold. "But you can't stay in there forever, Sarah. And we don't need to cross. We just need to wait. The hunger is patient. The hunger is older than the trees. Sarah reached the opposite bank, pulled herself out, lay gasping on the frozen moss. Her body was already starting to shake from the cold, the first warning signs of hypothermia. Her GPS was still working. Coordinates 478198, 123.9255. She was north of the elk carcass, maybe a mile. If she could make it to the main trail, if she could find Dave, if she could get to the truck. Her phone vibrated in her pocket. Impossible. No signal out here, but when she pulled it out with shaking hands, the screen showed a notification. A message from Austin Fletcher's number. Sent 3 minutes ago. She opened it with numb fingers. The message contained a single image. A photograph of the wall Austin had found in the old maintenance shed. The drawings were exactly as he'd described. Spirals made of animals and humans, and in the center, a figure. Tall, skeletal, crowned with massive antlers, its mouth open to show rows and rows of teeth. Around it, words in multiple languages, handwriting from different eras, different people, but they all said the same thing. Wendigo, Wedico, Wendigo, Wechugje, the spirit of insatiable hunger. Born from the first winter when humans ate human flesh to survive, it learned to love the taste. It hunts the lonely places. It transforms the greedy and desperate. 4 in a circle to make it whole. 4 in February to wake it fully. Beware the hunger that never ends. Below the ancient warnings, fresher graffiti. Recent. Sarah recognized some of the handwriting from maintenance reports, names scratched desperately into the wood. Lisa Peterson, Feb 14, 2006. It won't stop. So hungry. David Chen, Feb 9, 2005. My hands are changing. I can't go back. Kayla Morrison, Feb 21, 2004. I understand now. The forest needs to feed. And below those, in the freshest handwriting, Austin Fletcher, Feb 17, 2009. I'm sorry. It's spreading. It's always been here. We just forgot. Sarah looked up. Across the river, the shapes had multiplied. At least a dozen now, standing at the water's edge, watching her with their filmed eyes. Some were wearing clothes from different decades. How long had this been happening? How far back did it go? Austin stood in the center of them, still recognizable despite the transformation. The drawings showed something else. He called across the water. The Wendigo can be stopped, but it requires a sacrifice. Someone willing. Someone who accepts the hunger and uses it, turns it inward, starves it by starving themselves. But who would choose that, Sarah? Who would choose eternal hunger over eternal hunting? Sarah's teeth were chattering so hard she could barely speak. What happens if you get the 4th? We become fully what it wants us to be. We spread. The hunger spreads. By next February, there will be more. By the February after that, more still. Eventually, the forest will be sacred to it again, the way it was before the whites came, before the Kino learned to drive it back with their ceremonies. It just needs 4 to break the seal, 4 to make a complete circle, 4 to... A voice cut through the trees behind Sarah. Brennan! Sarah! Dave Kowalski burst through the underbrush, his camera kit banging against his back. He was breathing hard, his face red with exertion. I followed your GPS track when you didn't respond on the radio. What the hell are you doing in the... He stopped, saw the shapes across the river. His face went white. Dave, Sarah said quietly, we need to go. Now. But the shapes were already moving, spreading out along the riverbank looking for places to cross. Sarah's mind raced. Moving water stopped them, but the river was miles long. There would be shallow points, frozen sections, places they could cross. The old shed, she said suddenly. Austin found drawings there, warnings, maybe something else, something about how to stop this. Dave was still staring at the shapes. What are they? Something that's been here a long time. Sarah grabbed his arm, pulled him away from the river. Something we woke up. They ran together, Sarah's wet clothes freezing against her skin, Dave's breath coming in panicked gasps. The GPS led them southeast toward the maintenance facility. The shapes paralleled them on the opposite bank, never crossing but never falling behind, their movements tireless. The old shed was where Austin had left it, a weathered structure half hidden by moss and cedar growth. The door hung open. Inside, the air was somehow colder than outside, as if the building was exhaling winter. The wall was in the back room, behind rotted shelving that Austin had pulled away. The drawings covered the entire surface, layered over each other like archaeological strata. Sarah could see the oldest layer, pictographs in red ochre, Native American symbols warning of something in the forest. Over those, newer drawings, settler-era graffiti, Park Service notes from the 1960s, modern marker and pen. Every generation had found this place and added to the warning. And there, half hidden behind a support beam, something else. A small wooden box carved with symbols Sarah recognized from the training session with the Kinol Ranger. Protection symbols, binding symbols. She opened it with shaking hands. Inside, bundles of sage and sweetgrass, dried and ancient. A small knife, the handle wrapped in what looked like sinew, and a piece of birch bark covered in more symbols, with instructions written in cramped, desperate handwriting. The Wendigo cannot be killed, but can be contained. It feeds on hunger, on the space between wanting and having. To bind it, you must create a circle of hunger that consumes itself. The transformed cannot cross moving water, but can cross frozen ground. Build a fire circle at the place of first transformation. Draw them in with blood sacrifice. Contain them with smoke of sacred herbs. Starve the hunger by giving it nothing to hunt. The transformed will weaken. The spirit will sleep again. Until next time someone feeds it. That's insane, Dave whispered, reading over her shoulder. Blood sacrifice, we need to call this in, get a full team out here, armed response. With what? Sarah's voice was harsher than she intended. What are you going to tell them? That we have a Wendigo problem? That we need to contain a shape-shifting cannibal spirit with sage smoke? They'll pull us off duty for psych evals. Then what do you suggest? Sarah looked at the knife, at the dried herbs, at the desperate warnings covering the wall. I suggest we try not to become number 4. Outside, the shapes were circling. Sarah could hear them in the trees, their footsteps creating a perimeter around the shed. They couldn't enter. Some boundary protection in the old warnings kept them out. But they could wait. And Sarah and Dave couldn't stay here forever. Already Sarah's wet clothes were leaching heat from her body. She had maybe an hour before hypothermia became critical. The first transformation, she said slowly. Where Austin first changed. That's what it means by the place of first transformation. Where he read the warnings and the hunger took him. Here. This shed. Dave's eyes widened. You want to do the ritual here? While they're circling outside? You have a better idea? He didn't. Sarah gathered the sage and sweetgrass, arranging them in a circle pattern on the shed's dirt floor. The symbols on the birch bark showed a specific design, 4 points, 1 for each of the transformed. The instructions were terrifyingly specific. Fresh blood from a willing sacrifice to draw them in, sacred smoke to bind them, fire to contain the circle, and then the hardest part. Someone had to stay in the circle with them, had to face the hunger without feeding it, until they weakened enough for the spirit to sleep. I'll do it, Sarah said. Like hell. I'm already exposed. She touched her chest, where the hollow feeling had been growing all day. I've felt it since this morning. The hunger. It's subtle, but it's there. I think just being near them spreads it, like spiritual contagion. If we both stay, we're both at risk. One of us needs to get out. Report what happened, make sure this shed gets properly sealed off. Dave's face was torn. Sarah, you know I'm right. And you know I'm the only one who can do this. She held up her hand, stopping his protest. I've always felt things, Dave. You know that. Everyone knows that. My witch feeling. Maybe that's what makes me resistant, or maybe it makes me more vulnerable. Either way, I'm staying. She didn't give him time to argue. Using the ancient knife, she cut her palm, not deep but enough for blood to well up. She let it drip onto the 4 points of the circle, speaking the words written on the birch bark. They were in a language she didn't know, something guttural and old, but her mouth shaped them anyway. The temperature in the shed dropped. Outside, the shapes stopped their circling. In the sudden silence, Sarah heard Austin's voice. "She's calling us. The circle. She's opening the way." "Go," Sarah told Dave. "Get to your truck. Drive to headquarters. Tell them there was a gas leak in the old shed. Hallucination causing. Tell them I stayed to secure the scene. Tell them whatever you need to tell them to keep people away from here until spring. And if you don't come out, then tell them the truth. Show them the photographs. Let them decide what to believe." She lit the sage and sweetgrass with her emergency matches. Smoke billowed up, thick and sweetly acrid. "Go!" Dave ran. Sarah heard his footsteps, heard the shapes pursuing him for a moment before stopping. They understood. She was the sacrifice. She was the one who'd called them. They entered the shed one by one. Austin first, his transformed body moving with eerie grace. Then Lisa Peterson, her dead eyes fixed on Sarah. David Chen, ice crystals growing from his skin. Kayla Morrison, neck still bent impossibly, and behind them shapes Sarah didn't recognize. Earlier victims, further transformed, barely human anymore. They arranged themselves around the circle, inside the smoke barrier but not crossing the blood points. The sacred herbs kept them at bay, just barely. Sarah could feel their hunger like a physical pressure, a weight on her chest that made breathing difficult. "You can't win," Austin said softly. "The hunger is older than your herbs, stronger than your blood. It will outlast you, maybe," Sarah said. Her palm was still bleeding, dripping steadily onto the dirt. "But I don't have to win forever, just long enough." The ritual instructions had been clear. Face the hunger without feeding it. Stay in the circle until dawn. The transformed would weaken as the hunger turned inward, consuming itself without release. The Wendigo spirit would retreat, dormant, until another fool discovered the warnings and woke it again. The night stretched ahead of her like a chasm. The shapes watched her with their filmed eyes. Occasionally one would test the barrier, reaching toward her, but the smoke pushed them back. The hunger grew. Sarah felt it not just from them, but in herself. A gnawing emptiness that had nothing to do with her last meal. It was existential hunger, the kind that no amount of food could fill. The hunger for warmth in endless cold. The hunger for satisfaction that never came. The hunger to consume everything and still want more. Hours passed. The fire burned low. Sarah added more sage, more sweetgrass, keeping the smoke thick. Her hand had gone numb from cold and blood loss. Her wet clothes were frozen stiff. The hollow feeling in her chest had become a cavern, a void, an emptiness so vast she felt she might disappear into it. The shapes began to change. Slowly, infinitesimally. They were shrinking. The elongated limbs drawing back toward normal proportions. The excess teeth falling from their mouths like baby teeth. The ice-white skin regaining hints of human color. It was working. The hunger, denied any release, was consuming the transformation itself. Austin collapsed first, his body convulsing. The thing inside him was fighting, trying to keep its hold, but the circle was stronger. The binding was working. He curled into a fetal position, his breath coming in ragged gasps. "Sarah," he whispered. And this time it was just Austin's voice, no undertone of ancient hunger. "Sarah, I'm so cold." "I know," she said. "I know you are." One by one they fell. Lisa, David, Kayla. The others, their names lost to time. They lay in the circle, breathing but not moving, the transformation slowly, agonizingly reversing. Dawn broke. Light streamed through the cracks in the shed walls. The moment it touched the circle, the remaining smoke flared bright and then dissipated. The herbs were completely consumed. Sarah's blood on the 4 points had dried black. The shapes were gone. In their place, bodies. Human bodies. naked and hypothermic but alive, breathing. Austin's eyes were closed, but his chest rose and fell. His skin was pale but not ice white. His fingers were normal. His teeth, when Sarah checked with shaking hands, were human. She had no strength left to move. The hollow feeling in her chest was still there, would probably always be there, but it was quieter now. Contained. She'd fed nothing. The hunger had turned inward and consumed itself. She heard engines, voices. Dave had brought help. Sarah let herself slump against the wall, consciousness fading. Her last thought before darkness took her was of the wall behind her, the layers of warnings, the desperate messages from every generation. Someone would have to add another one. Someone would have to warn the next person who found this place. But not today. Today, she'd done enough. When Sarah woke, she was in Olympic Medical Center in Port Angeles. 3 days had passed. Severe hypothermia, blood loss, exhaustion. They told her she was lucky to be alive. They told her Dave had found her unconscious in the old maintenance shed, along with 4 other unconscious people, Austin Fletcher, and 3 previously missing persons, Lisa Peterson, David Chen, and Kayla Morrison. All alive, all suffering from extreme hypothermia and malnutrition, but alive. Kayla Morrison had been missing for 5 years. The doctors couldn't explain how she'd survived. None of them could remember anything after their disappearances. Austin had vague memories of wandering in the forest, of being so hungry, but the details were gone, dissolved like dreams. Sarah didn't correct them. She accepted the official explanation. Gas leak from old equipment in the maintenance shed, hallucination-causing fumes, everyone disoriented and suffering from exposure. It was neat. It was rational. It was the kind of explanation that would go in reports and close the case files. She never mentioned the drawings on the wall which Dave had photographed before the demolition crew arrived. The Park Service took the old shed down within a week, grinding it to splinters, scattering the debris. The official reason: structural instability. The drawings were gone. The warnings were gone. But Sarah knew they'd just be somewhere else. The Wendigo was old. It had been here before the trees, before the tribes, before anything human had walked these forests. It would be here after. It slept now, the hunger dormant, but not dead. Never dead, just sleeping. Sarah left the hospital after a week. The doctor recommended she take time off, maybe transfer to a less isolated station. The Park Service offered her a position at the visitor center in Port Angeles. No more solo work in the backcountry. She took it. At night, in her new apartment in town, she sometimes felt the hollow feeling in her chest. The hunger, dormant but present. A souvenir of her night in the circle. She'd faced something that couldn't be killed, only contained. She'd bound it with blood and smoke and will. But she'd also touched it. Let it touch her. You couldn't do that and come away unchanged. She didn't eat meat anymore. The thought of it made her stomach turn. She kept her apartment cold, always cold, because warmth felt wrong somehow. And sometimes, on February nights when the wind was right, she could hear footsteps in the forest. Barefoot steps, too fast, too regular, circling, hunting, hungry. She'd told Dave to keep the photographs locked away, to never show anyone, but she'd kept one copy for herself. The image of the wall, with all its warnings, all its desperate messages. She'd added her own note written on the back of the photograph. February 2009, 4 contained, binding held. The Wendigo sleeps but does not die. Do not disturb the old places. Do not read the old warnings aloud. Do not feed the hunger. If you must go into the deep woods in February, remember, moving water is protection. Sacred smoke is containment. Blood sacrifice is binding. And hunger, once awakened, never truly sleeps. S. Brennan. She kept the photograph in a locked drawer. Just in case someone needed to know. Just in case she needed to remember what she'd faced, what she'd contained, what still waited in the deep woods when February came around again. The Wendigo slept. But Sarah Brennan, 35 years old and forever changed, knew better than to think that meant it was gone. Some hungers never die. They just wait. Patient as winter, endless as appetite. Old as the first time a human looked at another human and felt not empathy but hunger. And somewhere in the Olympic National Forest, in the deep places where the moss grew thick and the canopy blocked the sun even at noon, the trees creaked in the windless air. Waiting. Always waiting. Hope you felt genuine terror. If you appreciate authentic horror rooted in real folklore, consider following for more stories. Which moment scared you most? Share your theory about what happened. The mushrooms grew in a perfect circle around where Emma Sullivan's tent had been. 36 specimens of a species Daniel Kowalski couldn't identify, each one facing inward like spectators at an execution. Daniel crouched at the perimeter, his knees protesting the movement. 15 years as a ranger in Olympic National Park had given him an encyclopedic knowledge of the Hoh rainforest flora, but these fungi defied classification. Their caps were an impossible shade of white, almost luminescent in the diffused morning light filtering through the Sitka spruce canopy. What disturbed him more was their arrangement. Too precise, too deliberate, too much like something he'd seen before in a place he tried hard not to remember. The campsite itself had been stripped clean. Emma Sullivan's tent was gone, along with her backpack, sleeping bag, and the extensive mycology equipment her research advisor had mentioned during the initial report. Only the mushroom circle remained, and a single item at its center, a composition notebook, its pages warped by moisture but otherwise intact. Daniel pulled on latex gloves before retrieving it. Professional protocol, though some primitive part of his brain screamed at him not to touch anything within that circle. He'd learned to trust that instinct back in 2004 during his second year at Olympic. He'd ignored it once, never again. The notebook's cover bore Emma's name in careful handwriting. Inside, the entries began mundane enough. Observations about old-growth forest ecosystems, sketches of various mushroom species, notes about soil pH levels, and rainfall measurements. Emma had arrived at the Hoh Rainforest Trailhead on October 17th, planning a week-long solo research trip for her master's thesis on fungal networks in temperate rainforests. Her faculty advisor, Dr. Patricia Chen, had approved the trip despite Emma's limited backcountry experience, citing the relatively accessible terrain and well-marked trails. That had been 9 days ago. Emma had missed her scheduled check-in on October 23rd. Her parents, waiting for their daily text message that never came, had contacted the Park Service on the 24th. Daniel had been assigned to the search yesterday, along with 2 other rangers and a volunteer SR team. They'd found her campsite at coordinates 47.8604 degree Nun, 123.9354 degree W, approximately 3.2 miles from the trailhead along the Hoh River Trail, at an elevation of 578 feet. They'd found the mushroom circle. They'd found the notebook. They hadn't found Emma Sullivan. Daniel flipped through the journal, watching Emma's entries transform. October 18th, enthusiastic observations about nurse logs and epiphyte communities. October 19th, detailed fungal sketches, mentions of unusual quiet in the forest. October 20th, notes about feeling watched, dismissing it as typical solo camping paranoia. October 21st, shorter entries, handwriting less steady, comments about dreams of standing water, and a woman's voice singing in a language she didn't recognize. October 22nd, the final entry. They're not mushrooms, they're fingers. All of them. Pushing up through the soil like they're trying to dig their way out. I can see the fingernails now. Why can I see the fingernails? The woman is standing at the edge of camp. She won't stop looking at me. Her face is wrong. Everything about her face is wrong. I need to leave, but I can't remember which direction is out. All the trees look the same. They're all watching. She's singing again. I know the words now. I shouldn't know the words. The entry ended mid-sentence, the final word trailing off into an illegible smear. Daniel stood slowly, his spine crackling. The forest around him maintained its oppressive silence. No birdsong, no small mammals rustling through the undergrowth. No wind moving through the canopy despite the October storm system that was supposed to arrive this evening. Just the distant white noise of the Hoh River, muffled and distorted by the vegetation. He keyed his radio. Kowalski to base. Over. Static, then Julie's voice from the ranger station at park headquarters. Go ahead, Daniel. Found Sullivan's journal at the campsite. No other signs of her presence. Journal entries suggest possible psychological distress. Requesting continuation of search with focus on the area within 2 miles of current location. He rattled off the coordinates, keeping his voice level and professional. Weather's holding for now, but that front's coming in. We'll need to expand the search grid before conditions deteriorate. Copy that. How's the journal look? Anything indicating direction of travel? Daniel glanced down at the final entry. Negative. Last entry is disoriented. No clear indication of intended movement. SAR team is en route to your location. ETA 45 minutes. Caldwell and Martinez are working the northern sectors. Be advised, we've got another report coming in. Hikers on the Sol Duke Valley Trail reported hearing singing last night around Oro 200 hours. Female voice, unfamiliar language. Location approximately 8 miles northwest of your position. Something cold settled in Daniel's stomach. Copy. We'll maintain current position until SAR arrives. He clipped the radio back to his belt and looked again at the mushroom circle. In the 7 years since he'd transferred from Crater Lake, Daniel had worked dozens of missing person cases in Olympic National Park. Most ended well. Confused hikers located within hours, injured climbers airlifted out, the occasional visitor who'd simply lost track of time. Some ended badly. Bodies recovered from falls, drownings, exposure. One case had never been resolved at all. That case had also involved mushrooms growing in impossible patterns. It had involved silence where there should have been sound. It had involved Daniel finding evidence that made no sense according to any rational framework. Evidence he'd documented carefully and completely. Evidence that had been dismissed by investigators as misidentification or contamination, or the unreliable observations of a stressed ranger working a traumatic search. Daniel had been 26 then, new enough to the job that he'd still believed documentation mattered more than politics. He'd learned otherwise. He'd also learned that some things in the forest operated according to rules that had nothing to do with the ones taught in ranger training or written in Park Service procedures. He'd spent the last 7 years trying to forget those lessons. The forest, it seemed, had other ideas. Daniel walked the perimeter of the mushroom circle, photographing it from multiple angles with his Nikon D90. The camera was old even by 2011 standards, but it was reliable and took excellent macro shots. He documented each fungus individually, noting their uniform size, their precise spacing, their identical orientation. Then he photographed the journal pages, being careful not to damage the moisture-weakened paper. The temperature had dropped noticeably in the 15 minutes since he'd arrived at the campsite. His breath misted in front of his face, which made no sense given that it was only mid-October, and the forecast high was 58 degrees. Daniel had seen plenty of strange weather in Olympic. The park received an average of 12 feet of rain annually, creating microclimates that could shift dramatically within short distances. But this cold felt different. It felt deliberate. He was putting the camera away when he noticed the trees. All around the campsite, the moss-covered trunks of the old-growth Sitka spruce bore marks, scratches shallow and precise arranged in vertical lines. They were new. The exposed wood beneath the moss was still pale, not yet darkened by oxidation or moisture. Daniel approached the nearest tree, a massive specimen easily 6 feet in diameter, and examined the marks more closely. Not scratches. Characters, kanji, unless he was mistaken, though his knowledge of Japanese was limited to the few phrases he'd picked up from his ex-wife during their brief marriage. These weren't random graffiti. They'd been carved with care, each character perfectly formed, each line exactly the same depth. There had been no mention of Japanese visitors in the area. The Hoh rainforest attracted tourists from around the world, but the vast majority came during summer months. Late October was shoulder season, with only the most dedicated hikers willing to brave the increasingly rainy conditions. Daniel photographed the characters, then moved to the next tree. More kanji, Different characters, but the same precise execution. He circled the campsite, documenting every tree within a 30-foot radius. All of them bore marks. All of them had been carved recently, within the last few days, he estimated, based on the condition of the exposed wood. His radio crackled. "Daniel, this is Martinez. You still at the Sullivan campsite?" "Affirmative. We've got something up here you need to see. Grid reference 47.8721, 123.9287, about half a mile northeast of your position. What have you got?" A pause. When Martinez spoke again, his voice had lost its usual casual tone. "Just come up here and bring your camera." Daniel marked his current location with flagging tape and headed northeast, following his GPS. The silence persisted as he walked, his boots squelching through the perpetually damp ground. The Hoh rainforest was among the wettest places in the continental United States, and the ground never truly dried out. Nurse logs, fallen trees in various stages of decay, carpeted the forest floor, giving rise to the next generation of spruce and hemlock in an endless cycle of death and renewal. He'd always found it beautiful here, in a primordial way, the sense of deep time, of processes operating on scales that made human concerns feel trivial. Today, though, the forest felt wrong, watchful, like every tree had eyes. He found Martinez standing at the base of a massive hemlock, staring up at something in the branches. The ranger was in his early 40s, ex-military, unflappable under normal circumstances. He looked flapped now. "Tell me you see it too," Martinez said without preamble. Daniel looked up. Suspended 20 feet above the ground, tangled in the hemlock's branches, was a dress. Not modern hiking clothes, a white kimono, formal and elaborate, the kind Daniel vaguely associated with traditional Japanese ceremonies. It hung perfectly still despite the slight breeze that had finally started moving through the canopy. No tears, no signs of weathering. The fabric pristine despite being exposed to the elements in one of the rainiest ecosystems on Earth. "How long has it been there?" Daniel asked. "No idea. Could be recent, could be months, but Daniel..." Martinez pointed. "Look at the branches." Daniel looked. The branches supporting the kimono were dead, their bark sloughing off, their wood darkened and brittle. But only those specific branches. The rest of the tree appeared healthy, its needles green and dense, its bark intact. The dead branches formed a perfect cradle around the suspended garment. "I already checked the base of the tree," Martinez continued. "No footprints, no signs of climbing, no equipment. No way to get it up there without leaving some kind of evidence." Daniel pulled out his camera and started shooting. "Any sign of Sullivan?" "Negative. Caldwell's working the creek bed about 200 yards south. Nothing so far." Martinez finally looked away from the kimono. "What the hell is this, Daniel? This doesn't make any sense." "No," Daniel agreed. "It doesn't. But it did make sense in a terrible way that Daniel had spent 7 years trying not to acknowledge. It made sense the same way the mushroom circle made sense, the same way the kanji carved into the trees made sense, the same way the complete absence of animal sounds made sense. "I need you to document everything within a 100-yard radius of this location," Daniel said. "Look for more carvings, more anomalies. Take photos of anything unusual. I'm going to check the creek bed with Caldwell." "Daniel, what's going on here?" "I don't know yet." It was only partially a lie. Daniel knew what was going on. He just didn't know why or how to stop it or how to explain any of it without sounding insane. "Just document everything, we'll figure it out." He left Martinez and headed south toward the creek, his mind racing. The kimono was a burial garment. He was almost certain of that. In Japanese tradition, the dead were dressed in white for cremation or burial, and yurei, the spirits of those dead, were said to wear such garments when they manifested in the world of the living. Daniel had spent considerable time researching Japanese folklore after his experience at Crater Lake. Not out of academic interest, but out of desperate need to understand what he'd encountered in those woods. The official report had called it a mountain lion attack, despite the evidence suggesting otherwise. Daniel had let the official story stand. He'd needed the job, needed to move forward, needed to stop seeing that woman's face every time he closed his eyes. The woman with white skin and black hair and eyes that reflected no light, who had stood at the edge of his peripheral vision for 3 days during that search, who had sung in a language that hurt his ears to hear, who had led them to the hiker's body arranged in a position no natural death could produce. The woman who had looked exactly like every description of a Uri, Daniel had found in his subsequent research. He'd convinced himself it had been stress, grief, the psychological weight of finding a mutilated body in the wilderness. The human mind could produce elaborate hallucinations under extreme circumstances. That was a documented fact. It made more sense than the alternative. But now, standing in the Hoh rainforest with Emma Sullivan missing and impossible mushrooms growing in circles and a burial kimono suspended in a tree, Daniel couldn't maintain that comfortable fiction anymore. He found Caldwell at the creek photographing something in the water. The ranger looked up as Daniel approached, his expression grim. "Footprints," Caldwell said, pointing. "Bare feet, small, probably female, leading into the creek and then nothing. They don't come out on either side." Daniel examined the prints. They were clear despite the constant moisture, pressed deep into the soft earth at the creek's edge. 5 prints total, each one showing distinct toe marks, all heading directly into the fast-moving water. The creek was about 15 feet wide here, 3 feet deep according to Daniel's experience, running cold and clear over smooth river rocks. "Water temperature?" Daniel asked. Caldwell had already checked. 42 degrees. Nobody's wading across this barefoot voluntarily. Could she have been disoriented? Hypothermic? Maybe, but why go into the creek at all? The trail's clearly marked, and why no prints coming out? Daniel had no good answer for that. He waded into the creek, gasping at the cold, and searched both banks for another 100 yards in each direction. Nothing. Emma Sullivan's footprints led into the water and simply ceased to exist. The SAR team arrived 2 hours later. 6 volunteers with years of experience searching Olympics-challenging terrain. Daniel briefed them on what they'd found, carefully editing out the more inexplicable details. Missing person, last known position, evidence of possible psychological distress, footprints leading to the creek. They spent the rest of the day searching in an expanding grid pattern from the original campsite. Covering 6 square miles of dense rainforest, they found nothing. No additional footprints, no torn clothing, no equipment, no sign that Emma Sullivan had ever existed beyond that mushroom circle and those impossible prints leading into the creek. They found other things, though. More kanji carved into trees, always in sets of 4 characters, always facing inward toward some central point. More areas of unnatural silence, pockets of cold air that persisted despite the surrounding temperature. And as the October light faded early under the rainforest canopy, they began to hear singing. It started as a murmur, barely audible over the sound of the creek. A woman's voice, high and clear, singing words in what Daniel's mediocre linguistic knowledge identified as Japanese. The melody was simple but haunting, the kind of tune that got into your head and refused to leave. Martinez was the first to mention it. Anyone else hearing that? Everyone stopped moving. 6 SAR volunteers, 3 rangers, all standing motionless in the gathering darkness, listening to a voice that came from everywhere and nowhere at once. "It's coming from downstream," one of the volunteers said. "No," another countered. "It's upstream. Definitely upstream." Daniel knew it was neither. The voice wasn't coming from any specific direction because it wasn't really a voice at all. Not in the conventional sense. It was something else. Something that bypassed the normal mechanisms of hearing and went straight into the brain. "Everyone back to the campsite," Daniel ordered. "Now. We're not searching in the dark." There were protests. SAR protocol emphasized the golden hours immediately after a person went missing, the critical window when they were most likely to be found alive. But Daniel pulled rank, citing safety concerns and the approaching storm. The team reluctantly complied, though he could see the questions in their eyes. They made it back to the Sullivan campsite just as the rain started, the first drops of what the forecast promised would be a significant weather system. Daniel had the team set up camp in a clearing 50 yards from the mushroom circle, which remained perfectly intact despite the increasingly heavy rain. "I'm staying here tonight," Daniel announced. "I want everyone else out at first light. Caldwell, Martinez, you'll lead the team back to the trailhead. I'll maintain radio contact and continue the search alone." "That's not protocol," Caldwell protested. "Nobody searches alone, especially not in these conditions." "I'm not asking for permission." "Daniel, what the hell is going on? What aren't you telling us?" Daniel looked at the circle of mushrooms, still luminescent in the darkness, still oriented inward toward that empty center where Emma Sullivan's tent had been. "I need you to trust me. All of you. Whatever happens, I need you out of this forest by dawn. That's an order." It spoke to their years of working together that they didn't argue further. Daniel had built a reputation as the steadiest ranger in the park, the one who never panicked, never broke protocol without good reason. They trusted him, even when they didn't understand. The team bedded down in their tents, though Daniel doubted anyone would sleep. The singing had grown louder as darkness fell, no longer a distant murmur but a clear, insistent melody that seemed to resonate in the bones. Daniel sat outside his tent, rain dripping off his hood, watching the mushroom circle. He'd brought his personal copy of Yokai, the World of Japanese Demons and Spirits by Shigeru Mizuki, purchased years ago during his desperate attempts to understand what he'd seen at Crater Lake. He read it now by flashlight, reviewing the sections on Yurei. Yurei were spirits of the dead who remained bound to the earthly realm by powerful emotions: rage, sorrow, love, revenge. They typically manifested as pale women in white burial kimono, their long black hair falling across their faces, their presence marked by cold spots and feelings of dread. They were most active at night, particularly during the hours between 2 and 3 a.m., when the barrier between the living world and the realm of the dead was thinnest. Traditional protections against Yurei included Shinto purification rituals, Buddhist sutras, salt, and specific kanji written on protective amulets. But these methods only worked if the Yurei's earthly attachment could be addressed, the wrong that bound them resolved, the injustice acknowledged, the grief honored. Some Yurei, though, were beyond appeasement. These were the Onryo, spirits so consumed by rage that they existed only to inflict suffering. They could curse the living, drive them mad, or simply kill them through supernatural means. The book included photographs of Yurei sightings, woodblock prints depicting traditional encounters, academic analyses of various regional Yurei legends. Daniel studied an image of a woman standing in water, her white kimono floating on the surface, her face obscured by wet black hair. The caption identified her as a specific type of Yurei associated with drowning deaths. At 2:47 a.m., according to Daniel's watch, the singing stopped. The silence that followed was absolute, pressing against his ears like physical pressure. Even the rain seemed muted, falling without sound through the trees. Daniel stood slowly, his hand moving to the Motorola radio on his belt, some part of him knowing it wouldn't work but checking anyway. Static, not the normal static of a working radio struggling with terrain and weather, but the corrupted static of a device that had simply ceased to function according to the laws of physics. She appeared at the edge of the clearing, standing just beyond the reach of his flashlight beam. A woman in a white kimono, her head bowed, her black hair hanging loose to her waist. She was too pale, her skin luminescent in a way that had nothing to do with reflected light, and she was wet, water streaming from her hair and clothes despite standing well away from the creek. Daniel wanted to run. Every primitive instinct screamed at him to flee, to get away from this thing that was so clearly wrong, so obviously not a living woman. But he'd run before at Crater Lake, and it had followed. They always followed. "Emma Sullivan?" he called out, knowing it was pointless but needing to hear his own voice, needing to maintain some pretense of normal investigative procedure. The woman's head tilted slightly, a gesture that seemed to require too many joints, too much articulation. Slowly, she raised her face. Daniel's flashlight beam caught her features, and he immediately wished it hadn't. Her eyes were black from lid to lid, reflecting no light, containing no pupils or irises or any of the structures that made eyes work. Her mouth was open, wider than any human mouth should open, revealing row after row of teeth that extended too far back into her throat. And her skin up close wasn't pale, it was translucent, showing the shadows of bones and vessels beneath, as if she were something dead pretending to be alive. She opened her mouth wider, impossibly wide, and the singing started again. But this close, Daniel could hear what it really was, not a melody, but a scream, sustained and modulated into something that resembled music, a sound of such pure anguish that it felt like knives in his ears. He stumbled backward, tripping over his camping chair, his flashlight spinning away across the wet ground. In the moment of darkness before he could grab it again, she moved, not walked or ran, but simply relocated, going from the edge of the clearing to directly in front of him with no transition, no movement through the intervening space. Daniel scrambled back, his hands finding the flashlight, swinging it up. She stood 5 feet away, head cocked at that wrong angle, water pooling at her feet despite the relatively dry ground beneath the canopy. Her black eyes fixed on him with an intelligence that was utterly inhuman. Then she spoke, and her voice was not the singing voice from earlier, but something else. Something flat and dead and terrible. "Where is my daughter?" The words were in English, accented but clear. Daniel's breath caught. "I don't understand. My daughter. Where is she?" The thing wearing the woman's shape took a step closer. Water squelched beneath her feet, though there was no water there. "You took her from me. You took her body. You hid her beneath the stones in the water where I cannot find her." "I didn't." Daniel forced himself to breathe, to think. This was a Uri. Uri were bound by specific rules, motivated by specific attachments. "I'm trying to help. I'm looking for someone." A young woman. Emma Sullivan. She disappeared. Emma. The name came out as a shriek, the sound of it literally painful, forcing Daniel to press his hands against his ears. Emma who promised. Emma who swore. Emma who broke her word and left me here alone in the dark, and the water with no one to sing the songs, no one to say the names. Daniel's mind raced. Emma Sullivan was a graduate student studying mycology. Nothing in her background suggested any connection to Japanese culture or tradition. But she'd written in her journal about singing, about knowing words she shouldn't know. What did Emma promise? Daniel managed to ask. The Uri's form flickered, her edges blurring and resolidifying. To remember. To tell the story. To bring my daughter home so I can rest. But Emma lied. Emma found the truth and ran. Just like the others. Just like all of them. What others? But the thing was already fading, becoming translucent, her voice receding. Find my daughter. Bring her home. Or join Emma in the water with the stones holding you down and the cold eating through your bones and the darkness lasting forever and forever and forever. She was gone, leaving only wet footprints that steamed in the cold air, evaporating as Daniel watched. He didn't sleep. Couldn't sleep. He sat with his back against a tree, his camping knife in one hand and his useless radio in the other, watching the mushroom circle and trying to process what he'd seen. A Uri in Olympic National Park. Not in Japan, where such spirits belonged according to folklore, but here in Washington State. Which meant either the folklore was incomplete, or something specific had brought this entity here. Or, and this was the possibility that made Daniel's skin crawl, Uri weren't bound to geographic locations but to people, to stories, to specific circumstances that could manifest anywhere. At dawn, he sent the SAR team back to the trailhead as planned. They went reluctantly, Caldwell in particular arguing that they should continue the search. Daniel remained firm. He needed them gone, needed to work alone, needed to follow the thread of this mystery without risking anyone else's life or sanity. After they left, he returned to Emma Sullivan's campsite and began a more thorough investigation. The mushroom circle remained intact, though the rain had turned the ground to mud everywhere except inside that perfect ring, which remained dry. Daniel carefully collected samples of the fungi, sealing them in plastic bags, knowing that later analysis would reveal nothing unusual. They were just mushrooms. The fact that they'd grown in an impossible pattern was merely the forest reflecting something deeper, something that operated according to rules science didn't acknowledge. He found Emma's field notebook where he'd left it, still dry despite the rain. He read through it again more carefully, looking for details he'd missed. There in the margin of an early entry, a note. Dr. Chen suggested the Nakamura site for comparison. Historical context might be interesting. Daniel pulled out his own notebook and flipped through his research notes. Olympic National Park had been the site of several Japanese-American settlements in the early 20th century, before internment during World War II. Most had been small logging operations or fishing villages. Most had been abandoned or destroyed after 1942, their residents forcibly relocated to camps. He radioed Julie back at headquarters. "I need historical records for Japanese settlements in or near the Hoh rainforest. Anything from 1900 to 1950. "That's pretty specific, Daniel. What are you looking for?" Background on the missing person case. Her research involved historical land use. It was technically true. Julie promised to pull what she could from the park archives and get back to him. Daniel spent the next hour carefully searching Emma's campsite, finding things he'd overlooked during the initial investigation. A small book tucked into a waterproof bag, its cover marked with Japanese characters. He opened it carefully. It was a diary, written in a combination of Japanese and English, dated 1941. The entries were sparse, written in a careful hand, describing daily life in a small community Daniel couldn't identify. The writer, a woman named Akiko Nakamura, wrote about her daughter Yuki, about preparing food, about her husband's work in the logging camps, about the beauty of the forest despite their difficult circumstances. The final entry was dated December 15, 1941, a week after Pearl Harbor. "They say we must leave, that we are dangerous, that we cannot be trusted. But where will we go? This is our home. Yuki was born here. My husband built our house with his own hands. We have done nothing wrong, but they say we must leave, and so we will leave, because there is no choice. I am afraid. I am so afraid of what comes next." The entry ended there. Daniel carefully turned through the remaining pages, all blank except for the last page, where someone had written in English in a different hand. Akiko Nakamura drowned in Hoh River, March 1942. Body never recovered. Daughter Yuki sent to Minidoka internment camp. Died of pneumonia, 1943, age 7. Below that, in the same hand but written more recently judging by the ink, "I promised to find where they buried Yuki. I promised to bring her home so Akiko can rest. But I can't find the records. It's like she never existed." Emma's handwriting. Daniel's radio crackled to life, making him jump. Julie's voice came through, clearer now that the storm had passed. "Daniel, I've got something weird. There was a settlement called Nakamura Camp about 8 miles northwest of your position, near Solduke River. Japanese immigrant families, about 40 people total. They were removed during internment. But here's the thing. There's a note in the file from the Park Service Rangers who inventoried the site in 1944. They reported finding signs of ritual activity, Shinto shrines, Buddhist altars, some kind of memorial markers. The Rangers were ordered to remove everything and burn it. They complied. Any mention of specific graves? Children's graves?" A pause. "No, why?" "Just following a lead. Thanks, Julie." Daniel studied his topographic map. 8 miles northwest would put the Nakamura campsite near the location where hikers had reported hearing singing. It would also put it upstream from where Emma Sullivan's footprints had led into the creek. He packed quickly and headed northwest, following game trails and his GPS. The forest remained unnaturally quiet, the silence broken only by his own footsteps and the distant rush of water. The kanji carved into the trees became more frequent as he walked, appearing every 100 yards or so, always in groups of 4 characters. Daniel photographed each set, knowing he'd need to get them translated later. He had a sinking suspicion he already knew what they said. After 3 hours of hiking, he found the settlement site. Or what remained of it. The forest had reclaimed most of the area, but the footprints of buildings were still visible. Rectangular depressions in the ground, a few stone foundations, rusted metal implements half buried in moss. And in the center of the clearing, A stone marker weathered by decades of rain but still legible. It was a memorial, the characters carved deep into granite. Daniel couldn't read Japanese, but he photographed it carefully, along with the smaller markers surrounding it. 16 of them, each one bearing a name and dates. One of them said Yuki Nakamura, 1936-1943. But the marker was here in Washington, not in Idaho where Minidoka Camp had been located, which meant someone had brought Yuki's remains back, or at least commemorated her here. Which meant, you found them. Daniel spun around. Emma Sullivan stood at the edge of the clearing, soaked and shivering, her hiking clothes torn and muddy. She looked alive, real. Nothing like the thing he'd seen last night. Relief and suspicion warred in his chest. Emma, are you hurt? She shook her head, teeth chattering. I'm so cold. I've been so cold since I went into the water. You need medical attention. How long have you been out here? I don't know, days? Hours? The time doesn't work right anymore. She wrapped her arms around herself. I found Akiko's diary at an estate sale in Seattle. I'm studying mycology, but I've always been interested in local history. And this diary, it was so sad. I wanted to do something, wanted to honor her story. So I researched the internment camps, found records of Yuki's death, discovered that someone, probably her father, had brought her ashes back after the war and buried them here. I thought if I could document it, if I could tell the story, it would mean something. And then Akiko appeared. Daniel said quietly. Emma's eyes widened. You've seen her. Last night, she's looking for Yuki. She doesn't know Yuki is right here. He gestured to the memorial markers. She died before the war ended. Her body was never found. She doesn't understand that her daughter was brought home. I tried to tell her, Emma whispered. That first night when she appeared at my campsite, I tried to explain, but she couldn't hear me. She just kept asking where her daughter was, kept saying I'd promised to bring her home. I got scared and ran. I thought if I could get to the river, cross it, the water would protect me. That's what the books say about spirits. Running water stops them. You're still alive? I think so. But I've been in the forest for so long, hiding from her, drinking creek water and eating berries, and I'm so cold. And sometimes I see things that can't be real, and I'm not sure anymore. Her voice broke. Am I alive? Or am I like her now? Daniel approached slowly, extending his hand. Emma reached out and her fingers were solid, cold but definitely real. He felt her pulse, faint but present. You're alive. Hypothermic, probably dehydrated, but alive. We need to get you out of here. She won't let me leave. Every time I try to find my way back to the trail, I end up back at her campsite. The trees move. The paths change. She's keeping me here. Because she thinks you can help her find Yuki. Daniel pulled out his camera and showed Emma the photos of the memorial stones. Yuki is here. She's been here since 1945 or 46. But Akiko doesn't know. She's been searching for 80 years, and her daughter has been right here the entire time. Emma stared at the photos. How do we tell her? How do we make her understand? Daniel thought about the kanji carved into the trees, the mushroom circles, the singing. In his research after Crater Lake, he'd read about various methods for communicating with Yurei, most of them requiring elaborate rituals performed by trained priests. But there was one method that appeared consistently across different sources. Acknowledgement. Bearing witness to the injustice that bound the spirit. Speaking the truth aloud. Making the invisible visible. We tell the story, Daniel said. All of it. We acknowledge what happened to them. He pulled out his notebook and wrote down everything he knew about Akiko and Yuki Nakamura. The dates, the places, the injustice of their separation, and Akiko's death. The devotion of whoever had brought Yuki home. He wrote about Emma's attempt to honor their story, about the diary that had survived all these years. He wrote about the internment, about families torn apart by fear and racism, about a mother who drowned searching for her daughter, and a daughter who died alone in a camp far from home. Then he read it aloud in the clearing, his voice carrying through the silent forest. Emma joined him, adding details from the diary, speaking Akiko's words in her own voice, making the dead woman real again through memory and acknowledgement. Nothing happened at first, then gradually the temperature began to rise. The oppressive silence lifted, birds beginning to call in the canopy above. A beam of sunlight broke through the clouds, illuminating the memorial stones. And standing next to Yuki's marker, no longer terrifying but simply sad, stood Akiko Nakamura. She looked different in daylight, still pale, still wearing the white kimono, but her features were soft now, recognizably human. She looked down at the stone bearing her daughter's name, and her translucent hand reached out to touch it. "Yuki," she whispered, "you came home." "Your husband brought her back," Daniel said gently. "After the war, he never forgot." Akiko's form began to fade, becoming translucent, wisps of her drifting away like morning mist. But before she disappeared entirely, she looked at Emma and Daniel, and her expression was one of profound relief. "Thank you," she said, her voice no longer terrible but soft, almost musical. "Thank you for remembering." Then she was gone, leaving only a faint scent of jasmine in the air. Emma collapsed, and Daniel barely caught her before she hit the ground. Her pulse was thready, her lips blue with cold. He radioed for emergency extraction, giving their coordinates, requesting immediate medical helicopter. Then he wrapped her in his jacket and his emergency blanket, building a fire with shaking hands. The helicopter arrived 40 minutes later, its rotor wash scattering leaves and moss across the clearing. The paramedics loaded Emma onto a stretcher, hooking her up to IV fluids and monitoring equipment. Daniel watched them work, feeling the exhaustion of the last 2 days finally catching up with him. "You should come too," one of the paramedics said. "You look like hell, man." "I need to document the site first. I'll hike out later." After the helicopter left, Daniel sat alone in the clearing, surrounded by memorial stones. He thought about Akiko and Yuki, about families destroyed by hatred and fear, about grief so powerful it could transcend death itself. He thought about the Park Service rangers in 1944, who had burned the shrines and altars, erasing any trace that these people had existed, had lived and loved and died here. He photographed every marker, documenting each name and date. He would file a report, make sure these graves were officially recorded, make sure they would be protected and remembered. It was a small thing, maybe meaningless in the grand scheme, but it was something. The forest around him had returned to normal, birds singing, small animals rustling through undergrowth, wind moving through the canopy. The oppressive silence was gone, along with the cold pockets and the singing, and the sense of being watched. Akiko Nakamura had found her daughter and finally, after 80 years, found rest. Daniel packed his equipment slowly, knowing he should feel relieved, victorious even. They'd found Emma alive, against all odds. They'd resolved a case that by all rights should have ended in tragedy, but he felt hollowed out, scraped clean of something essential, because he knew now, with absolute certainty, that what he'd seen at Crater Lake 7 years ago had been real. The woman in white, the impossible circumstances, the evidence that made no sense, all of it real, which meant there were other cases, other forests, other spirits bound by grief or rage or injustice, and next time, he might not be so lucky. Next time, the story might not have an ending where everyone walked away. He started the long hike back to the trailhead, his boots squelching through mud, his muscles aching. Somewhere in the trees a raven called, 3 sharp cries that echoed through the forest. In Japanese folklore, ravens were messengers between the worlds of the living and the dead. Daniel didn't look back. Emma Sullivan spent 3 days in the hospital recovering from severe hypothermia and dehydration. Physically, she made a full recovery. Psychologically was another matter. She dropped out of graduate school 3 months later, unable to return to fieldwork, unable to sleep without lights on, unable to explain to her therapist what had really happened in the forest without sounding insane. Daniel filed his official report, documenting the discovery of the Nakamura settlement site and recommending historical preservation. He carefully edited out anything that couldn't be explained through conventional means. The mushroom circle became Unusual fungal growth, possibly due to soil contamination. The kimono in the tree became historical artifact of unknown origin, removed for laboratory analysis. The kanji carvings remained kanji carvings, but he attributed them to modern vandalism rather than supernatural manifestation. His supervisor praised the report for its thoroughness and sensitivity to the historical context. The Nakamura site was officially designated as a protected historical area. A small plaque was installed near the memorial stones, acknowledging the Japanese-American families who had lived there before internment. Daniel was commended for his work on the Sullivan case, for finding her alive when the odds suggested otherwise. He accepted the commendation with quiet thanks and went back to his regular duties: trail maintenance, visitor education, wildlife monitoring. Normal ranger work that didn't involve Uri or grief so powerful it persisted beyond death. But he kept Akiko's diary, tucked away in his locker at the ranger station. And sometimes, on quiet nights when he was alone in the forest, he would take it out and read her words, bearing witness to a life that had been deliberately forgotten, making sure someone remembered. The mushroom circle at Emma Sullivan's campsite faded away over the following weeks, the fungi decomposing back into the soil, leaving no trace they'd ever existed. The kanji carvings on the trees gradually weathered and healed, the exposed wood darkening and sealing over. The kimono, when analyzed in the laboratory, turned out to be authentic ceremonial wear from the 1940s, made of real silk, impossibly well preserved despite apparent exposure to the elements. It was cataloged and stored in the park archives, another artifact of a forgotten history. Daniel Kowalski continued working as a ranger in Olympic National Park for another 6 years before transferring to a desk job at Park Service headquarters in Washington, D.C. He never spoke publicly about what he'd seen in the Hoh rainforest, never tried to convince anyone that Uri were real or that some disappearances in the wilderness involved forces that couldn't be explained by hypothermia or falls or animal attacks. But he kept researching quietly and privately, documenting patterns he saw in certain cases, noting the common threads, the silence, the cold, the sense of wrongness, the evidence that didn't fit, building a database of impossibilities, waiting for the next time the forest needed someone who understood. Because Daniel had learned finally and completely that the wilderness held more than just animals and weather and geological processes. It held stories, memories, grief that refused to die. And sometimes those stories demanded to be heard by whatever means necessary. The Hoh rainforest continued growing, trees reaching skyward, moss carpeting everything, the endless cycle of death and renewal playing out across centuries and millennia. And deep in the forest, where very few people ventured, the memorial stones for Yuki Nakamura remained undisturbed, no longer mourned by a grieving ghost, but remembered nonetheless, their names carved in granite where the rain could not wash them away. On certain nights, hikers in the area reported hearing singing, a woman's voice high and clear, no longer anguished but peaceful, like a lullaby. And sometimes, in the early morning mist, there were reports of two figures walking through the trees, a woman in white and a small child, hand in hand, fading into the fog before anyone could get a clear look. Daniel heard these reports and said nothing, filing them away with all the other impossible things he'd collected over the years. Some mysteries, he'd learned, weren't meant to be solved. Some stories didn't need endings, just acknowledgement that they existed at all. The forest kept its secrets as it always had. But now at least Akiko and Yuki Nakamura were together again, their story remembered, their grief finally laid to rest. And in the deepest part of the night, when Daniel woke from dreams of white figures and impossibly wide mouths and singing that hurt to hear, he would remember the jasmine scent that had filled the clearing when Akiko faded away, and he would know that some things in the darkness were not evil, just lost. That knowledge didn't make the nightmares any easier to bear, but it made them bearable at all. Hope you felt genuine terror. If you appreciate authentic horror rooted in real folklore, consider following for more stories. Which moment scared you most? Share your theory about what happened.